Thank you for coming. I want to start off with a moment of childhood. This is a summer roll. Some of you will be like, what the hell is that? That is an ancient artifact. I've never seen that before in my life. To some of you, this is 12 years old at the intermediate school, the tastiest, most amazing treat, a delicious coconutty bar with chocolate that your mum would buy you once on Fridays, and you would eat and savour. I found out last week when I tried to buy this that these are no longer technically made. They are no longer produced. For some reason, they killed our childhood and stopped selling them. But I found a slightly dodgy dairy, and in the front thing, there's this little packet. I'm like, are those summer rolls? And they're like, yes. I'm like, are they expired? And they're like, no idea. So a little ritual that I've had, basically from when I was a child, is I think of these things for me as an ordeal leading to a reward. And it's usually a chocolate bar, but for this special audience, I thought, again, childhood is my reward. So what I'd like to do, and I'll introduce myself better in a sec, we're going to go on a little journey in a pretty small rowboat for about the next 40 minutes. I hope to entertain you. I hope to somewhat inform you. I might appall you at points, but hopefully at the end of it, when we get there, we've all had a great time. And you're going to see me tear the label off this expired piece of childhood and take a triumphant bite. And what I'd love you to do at that point is to burst into raucous applause like you've just seen the best movie of your entire lives. Do we have a deal? Yes. Excellent, we're on board. I love it, thank you. So this presentation, as I understand it, is in the project management and QA track. This will not be, I think, the most straightforward of those things. This is not going to be a presentation about how to run a sprint zero or how to get into the real details of process. What I'd like to do instead is bring in some perspectives from outside of gaming. I've had a very strange life, and I've been lucky enough to be around some fairly odd projects that all in their own ways have operated under great pressure and have really gone off the rails. And what I've found from this, I think, is that almost all projects, especially interesting ones, especially troubled ones, they all kind of have the same arc. And so what I'd love to do, if you don't mind, is take you through some very broad things that I've observed and get us into a sort of interesting space where everything seems like it's completely broken, which I think is a very familiar feeling to anyone who's ever made anything, and then talk about the ways out of it. So the little journey that we're going to take. A little bit about me. So my background, it is quite a mixed background. My general tendency is that I basically help plan things, so the strategy. I try and help fix things when the strategy doesn't work, which is crisis. And then kind of in the middle, we try and help steer things so that the strategy doesn't turn into the crisis. That's my general kind of work pattern. I've worked on big things, so I've been in government 3 times, working on things like the housing crisis, the Canterbury earthquakes, and a royal inquiry recently. And that gives you a sense of kind of, big, old institutional structures trying to do things. Much more interestingly to me, and more recently, I'm quite involved in startups, especially the early stage of tech startups, where you're kind of getting from a small group of people with a great idea, ideally through to here is some money and some structure, which is really fun. And in the middle, things that are growing, things that are not necessarily small or large, but are getting there. I was at Xero during a particularly interesting and teenage phase of Xero, which we will talk about. I've worked on film, TV, and game development in various forms, and I worked briefly at what is now Pickpock, but was She, on one of their most interesting projects. So as you can see, my tendency is to follow my interests and end up in strange places. The CV is a mess. It's a wandering trail of why the hell did you do that, but it makes for a good life sometimes. I struggle with the word neurodivergent. We are not getting into an argument over terminology around these things. I'm kind of weird, and from childhood, I've tended to see things at a bit of an oblique angle, and you'll probably see this through this talk. One of the reasons I bring that up is, I think, especially in games, we're in this fantastic era of very much opening the door to the idea that people think about things, see things, experience things, feel things differently, genuinely differently. There's not necessarily a default, which there certainly used to be, and I'm enormously encouraged by the idea of a kind of full continuum approach to the world. And pretty much intentionally or not, you will tend to find that I embody that. Then, this is the rowboat that I am asking you to jump in with me today, the Waka. Yes, I spotted that t-shirt. I was like, oh man, I want that t-shirt. So yes, as I said, what I'm really focusing on is not so much game development projects, although I'm going to try and link them through, but projects in general that are at the edges of experience in some way. Weird, odd, stressed, out of sight. And the defining feature, I think, of this, which again I think we've all experienced, is when something hits the edge, you have this collapse. Your frameworks don't work, your process goes out the window, and as humans, we find ourselves way beyond our comfort zones. Again, I think everyone knows that feeling. I'd like to put some quite specific sort of labels to that. And what you find yourself in any project that goes into this zone is you're in this thing that we call the tangle. And my shorthand for the tangle is it's that point where you have completely forgotten why the hell you ever got into this, and you have also lost sight of what you're trying to get to, and you're in that really distinct point where you're like, this is a washing machine, everything's upside down. This, in my experience, happens in most creative processes. It happens in a lot of projects, happens in a lot of businesses, and it's a really distinct psychological space for human beings to be in. And that space is both very distressing, but in a weird way, almost all of our favorite games, favorite movies, favorite things, almost all of those projects went into that space at some point. And the thing that I like to assert and convince you of in this tiny robot of ours is that even though the tangle feels awful, humans hate it. We can function. It's not all lost, even though it very much feels like it. And then out of that, you can find a way forward that's often messy, often not by the book. But again, most of the most interesting projects find that way somehow. This is the rowboat. This is my childhood. Again, shall we go? Brilliant. Thank you. Appreciate it. Right, so I'm going to draw on some things. This is a sort of list. Some of these things I am not going to talk in specifics about, and I'll tell you why. But in terms of the things that I've been around, that I'm kind of feeding into this conversation, here is what we're going. So I was part of the Canterbury earthquake recovery, which was, as most of you know, Canterbury, New Zealand was rocked by a sequence of massive earthquakes in 2010, 2011. The entire central city was effectively destroyed, and perhaps even more interestingly, almost all of the structures and institutions of Christchurch collapsed. So I was around that. I was at zero, specifically zero in about 2015, which was, I'm going to kindly call it, the awkward, horrible teenage years of zero, where it was no longer a really fun startup, and it was not yet a large, fairly well-run corporation. It was trying to get from one to the other. And they had taken, which again is perhaps a familiar message for the games industry, they had been doing very well, and then they took a very large amount of money from Silicon Valley investors that came with very large expectations attached. And you suddenly had to transform a kind of happily 400-person company into a 2,000 plus person company very quickly. And that is what I mean about the teenage years. There is some growth going on there. I was one of the writers on Blood Drive, which is the game that our very dear colleagues at Pickpock/G Interactive do not talk about. It's the phantom game in the history. I have, by the way, enormous admiration for what Mario and the team have made. It is an amazing organisation. Everyone that I have met from Pickpock is great. It is not my job to come here and hassle that. It is my job to come here and say, Blood Drive is a great example of what happens when a project just goes off the rails, largely not through the fault of the people trying to make the game. It was an interesting experience. On a more serious note, and this is one of the ones that I'm really not going to talk about specifically, but it's very much informed my thoughts. 7 years ago, a Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care was formed. And what this was essentially a project, if you like, to investigate 50 years of abuse of mostly children in New Zealand's institutions, including things like orphanages, faith-based institutions, those type of things. The final report of that inquiry was released recently, and the government is considering its response. You talk about dark, very difficult territory. This is kind of the ultimate thing. It's one of those things that for me made me feel like, oh, I love so much everything else that I've ever done because it's also warm and cuddly by comparison. I need to be really clear, and this is a thing that's, I think, genuinely important. Any points I make, indirectly or directly, about that inquiry, I am not talking about the survivors of abuse themselves or their experiences. it's extraordinarily important, especially when you start dealing with these people. They feel very strongly and rightly that it's essentially nothing about us without us. Their experiences, the things that they want, the varied ways in which they want to heal are theirs, and it's not at all my position to stand up here and comment on that. So anything I talk about with that inquiry is about it as a project, separate from the experiences of the survivors of abuse. We also have Tick, which is a startup that none of you have ever heard of because it never even got past Series A stage, but was a great experience in terms of why don't things work sometimes. There are two anonymous startups that I can't name. One is The Travel Thing, which was from about 15 years ago, and the other thing was building an agency, an anonymous agency. We will also meet, I'm very excited about this, a special guest history star, which will come on and sweep aside all of your assumptions and feelings about what's hard and what's not. I'm looking forward to really introducing you to our friend, the special guest history star. So, when we are running a project of any kind, literally just a person or a group of people setting off to do something, I think we would all know in this room, as essentially students and professionals, there's kind of a bunch of things that on the first page of any textbook says, if you have all these things, you probably do pretty well. You want a goal. And I know that this is like first page of the textbook type stuff, but we're going to talk a lot about how actually knowing what the fuck you're trying to do is astonishingly important and gets lost. If you have a goal, then you have a set of processes in order to reach that goal. You might have an agile-ish rhythm of sprints. You might have whatever your studio has developed as their method. One way or another, there's usually some kind of framework that you're trying to fit things into. And if you have a good set of frameworks and processes, in general, that allows you to execute. You want the right people in place. And again, kind of fundamental. One of the first things you observe on projects is not necessarily that people are like good or bad, but are people in positions to play to their strengths and to contribute in their best way to those projects. So you want the right people in the right place, essentially. You want the right resources. Money is often a resource. Time is often a more precious resource. Various things like that. Less obvious, I suspect, is that you really want supportive stakeholders. And what I mean by stakeholders in the sense is literally just anyone with a stake in the project. So your partner companies, your investors, people inside the building as well. But one way or another, if the stakeholders are in some kind of broad agreement, things will go well. And intentionally at the bottom instead of the top, if all those things are in place and being maintained, there's this kind of snake eating its tail thing where you kind of have effective leadership. And effective leadership looks effective when these things are working. So it's this kind of wrapped up package, which I think we all know of in some form or another. If these things are going well, life is good. If you can maintain these things throughout a project, you have a very high chance of delivering on the thing that you're trying to deliver. And of course, then there is reality, my friends. Then there is the experiences that I suspect most of the people in this room have had. So, projects at the edge of experience. This is Christchurch. I believe that this is Christchurch on the date of the largest of the 5 main sequence earthquakes, which was a 7.2, which occurred in 2011. I was not in that quake. I was actually in America at the time, but everyone that I know who was in that quake has described it as absolutely terrifying, especially because if you're in the central city, you know, buildings were collapsing and sort of bits of masonry and glass were falling everywhere. But even if you're out in the suburbs, it just kind of kept on going, is my understanding. It was a very, very long quake, which is really characteristic of a really strong one. And it physically destroyed the central city. So immediately, Christchurch was plunged from kind of, we have had some earthquakes, to we are now in real trouble. And there's obviously some kind of irony, which is apparent to almost everyone, which is, you know, if you have lived in Wellington for any period of time, you're constantly aware that at some point in the future, Wellington is going to have the big quake. It's kind of built into the back of your mind. My understanding from basically knowing many people in Christchurch is that that was not what life in Christchurch was. You did not wander around going, we're going to have a bunch of big quakes. So this pushes you out. And interestingly, so with Christchurch, we're going to divide the two phases. The first phase, which is the kind of immediate emergency response, which is this is people. Search and rescue, all of the kind of literally putting out fires, literally pulling people out of buildings, securing the whole situation, actually was one of the best responses that's ever been recorded in the world. It was an amazingly effective and professional and really, really strong thing. Most of the search and rescue people who took place in that take immense pride. The real challenge, arguably, for Christchurch and Canterbury actually came later, after the 5 earthquakes had happened, because what happened there was the various pressures that were put on the kind of governance of the city wrecked all the structures. Christchurch City Council essentially collapsed. A lot of the associated organisations, and there were hundreds of them, all kind of rolled up. And what I'd like to, it's a completely different talk, but basically if you have councils and institutions and organisations that have been used to kind of doing their thing, and then they get exposed to a massive stress shock, and suddenly they're having to do things at a totally different clip, totally different decisions, they've never been here, it's very, very hard for organisations like that to survive. A bad example, but right now, Wellington City Council at the moment, regardless of any of the many feelings we may have, is under a lot of pressure and is having to do things that it's not used to doing, and you can see the very public cracks. So what happens then is, under pressure, our processes and our frameworks and our ways of working, they're kind of the first thing to go. You're not just showing up to work on Monday and you're doing your thing that you do on Monday and you're not having the morning tea. Like, I laugh a little bit, but this stuff is really real. As your process starts to fray and disintegrate, that's the first sign that we're getting into kind of strange, really strange territory. On the other end of things, an extremely promising and very hard-working studio, named at the time She Interactive mostly, had been working for years mostly on work-for-hire material, and then had produced some really great original games, including the classic Shatter, and got the opportunity essentially to pitch their own IP to Activision, a major studio, and to make a game. And at the time, this is amazing. This is the arc that you want as a video game studio. You do the hard yards, you get the big chance. This is 2009 to basically 2010. What you then had, and again, I do not want to speak for Mario and his entire organisation, but you then had extensive negotiations back and forth with the publisher and changing of executives at the publisher, which if you have been around this for a while is the very first danger sign. If the different people are on the calls, you need to completely start from scratch. And over time, what happened was the game that was pitched shrank, which happens quite a lot. The money that was sort of promised for that game shrank even more. And most importantly, the time in which it was expected to be delivered shrank right down. And from those different pressures, I mean, saying now, like basically standing here and looking back, it seems obvious, but you don't have the right resources. And this again is a gigantic danger sign. A first principles danger sign is time crunched beyond recognition, then let's really look at this. And then what happens is as soon as your things start to crunch like this, you almost always lose sight of your goal. In the middle of Blood Drive's development, if you had asked for a kind of consensus view on what is the game that we are making and why, you would have gotten as many answers as there were people at the studio. Christchurch was interesting in a different way because, okay, you have essentially a broken city. What are we trying to do? We have stopped, in that sense, we've stopped trying to save people from the rubble that has been done. What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to rebuild a city? Okay. Are we trying to pay people for their houses that were destroyed, which is something that no Western government had ever done at scale? Are we trying to get insurance companies back online so that the insurance process can play out, even though insurers promptly ran a mile as soon as there was a large earthquake? What are we actually trying to do here? And that clarity, once your process goes, and especially if you don't have the resources you need, you'll just suddenly find, almost like magic, no one's quite sure what the fuck we're doing here. Again, a really clear sign. And this leads inevitably, as soon as your kind of ideal process starts to collapse, you get into the much more human territory where the comfort zones go. And this is where it shifts from being a kind of abstract problem, a systems problem if you like, it shifts hard into a human problem of what happens to humans individually and as a group under stress. What happens when the comfort zones get removed? So again, just to reiterate, anyone who was working in Christchurch during this time, especially at the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Agency, which was the thing, it's not just that you're kind of showing up to work and doing a hard job. You are in a really bizarre Alice in Wonderland environment where you have things like these train tracks, which is I mean, literally when I saw that, I just thought that's so badly photoshopped. Why would anyone use that? Nope, that's a result of the highest ground acceleration ever recorded in an earthquake. And more importantly, even, you're actually going home probably to a house that is maybe a bit broken, maybe it got flooded, maybe your backyard is this weird bog that keeps on making noises at night. That actually happened. You're not just a kind of functioning human being with a nice, comfortable home to go to. A lot of people were coming home from their very hard job and facing, oh yeah, and the ceiling still hasn't been fixed, and the builder's not going to come for 14 months. So comfort zones vanish, they go. One moment of slight seriousness. This was something that we saw in the Abuse and Care Inquiry. So this is an artwork called The Secret Keeper, and it's by an artist called Catherine Daniels, who is a survivor. Again, completely setting aside the thousands of the survivors of abuse, the people actually working at the Abuse and Care Inquiry, some of them had been there for 3, 4, 5 years. And on a daily basis, they have comfy homes, but they are dealing with material that is utterly upsetting. And I came into the thing very late, but one of my first observations was most of the people in this office, as it were, are showing signs of delayed slow trauma. And the thing about something like this, when you're on something that feels deeply meaningful to people, and I think games actually really do fall into this, there's that really weird space where you know that it's eating you up, but you really, really, really want to do it. It's not just like that job you hate. You're locked in. And this kind of cycle was very evident at the Abuse and Care Inquiry. Even the most resilient, sort of toughest people, they had basically fed their brains through puree, and at the same time felt an absolutely undying commitment to securing justice for the truth and for survivors. And again, a weird thing that happens is once you come under enough pressure, and once people themselves are not sleeping, not eating properly, their marriages or their relationships are disintegrating, their minds are chewing. If this is happening across your ecosystem, your stakeholder relationships go. The calls to the investors at Activision get increasingly testy. The relationships with other people in your space that you kind of have to work with, but you can't tell them what to do, suddenly people are showing up and there's arguments. And again, these little signs, like normally, under normal circumstances, groups of people can work together. But all of a sudden, all the little arguments come up, even internally. Why are we having that fight? Why are we arguing over lunch about this thing that is so small, but we took 2 hours, and everyone ended up pissed off and there was no solution? The relationships, and especially the stakeholder relationships, start to fray. Xero. I believe this is Xerocon 2014 or 2015. A oft-forgotten fact, I suspect, is that at the core, Xero is ultimately accounting software. It's really boring. And Xero did an amazing, remarkable job of taking what many would have argued was literally the most boring software category ever and turning it into this rockstar rocket ship journey, wah, sort of thing. And this was very smart, and I admired it a great deal. And they created this thing called Xerocon, which literally the goal of Xerocon was to make accountants feel like rock stars. That was the mission of Xerocon. So you imagine showing up to an accounting conference. I'm genuinely not hassling accountants, but that does not sound that interesting. And they wanted to be like, no, you're going to come back from ZeroCon like, oh, it's a zero type thing, like, raw. And it actually worked. It worked really well. There was a cult-like atmosphere, which you could argue was disturbing or not, but like it kind of worked. But yes, at this point, and this is a thing of larger organizational development, but it happens almost any time that you significantly change size as an organization. I suspect that Xero, when it was sort of 20 to 50 people, like a lot of organizations in New Zealand, 20 to 50 people with a kind of charismatic, engaging leader really out front. I suspect it was an incredibly fun project because they had very early success and everyone was basically personal friends with Rod Drury, who's the founder of Xero, and that was probably really fun. And then you kind of start to realize, oh, we're getting so successful that maybe we should really do something with it. And at the point where the large Silicon Valley investment firm comes along and they go, okay, here are, a lot of money, but with this money comes, we want you to do a lot of stuff. We want you to turn into a global company genuinely. And especially we want you to crack America, which is so easy. Everyone knows that. America's the easiest market of all. And this, when I was there, my observation was that this was a company very much moving from everybody knew each other, everything was friendly, to a lot of people got hired very, very, very fast. There was a period where essentially if you could chuck a resume over the fence, you had a really good chance of starting at Xero the next week type thing. And I think we've seen parallels to this. There are some really interesting parallels in the games industry. Two that I highly recommend if you haven't seen them. There's the giant 2 Double Fine documentaries, which are each like dozens of hours of Double Fine, which is run by Tim Schafer over in San Francisco. They let cameras into their studio for months on end and were actually really upfront about just letting you show it. And I think especially the most recent Double Fine documentary, which traced Psychonauts 2, you can see the change in their project and also their corporate ownership because they got bought by Microsoft. You can see this shift coming in. Change is not bad, but it affects things. The other thing is I'm reading the new book by Jason Schreier, which is called Play Nice, which is the history of Blizzard. And you want to talk about the exemplar of every single thing that we are talking about today. My impression so far is that in its early days, its kind of first 10 years in the 90s, Blizzard on its own terms seems to have been overall a really cool place to work. It was very bro-oriented. It was a frat house. That's what that game studio was at the time. But they worked very hard, probably too hard. They cranked out a bunch of games that were really good and hugely successful, Warcraft, Diablo, StarCraft, and broadly speaking, seems to be really enjoying themselves. And then this little project on the side kind of creeps in and someone goes, well, EverQuest is quite cool. Why don't we do something like EverQuest but for Warcraft? And everyone's like, oh yeah, that'd probably be a good project. And World of Warcraft launches in 2004 and absolutely annihilates every single expectation that anyone ever had for how fast a game could grow, how fast the money could pour in, because you're getting $15 a month for every player, which is why everyone tried to make MMOs at the time. And so all of a sudden, they go from the problem of, hey, how do we make a good game? How do we sort of keep ourselves going to, how do we become a 2,000-person company with a global customer service and every single developer pouring themselves into World of Warcraft updates? And how do we roll out servers? Because our 3-year plan for server rollout got eaten in the first week of World of Warcraft's release. Same thing. So it's Xero, arguably less interesting than World of Warcraft. But it's really interesting to read the same problems. Huge growth. The problem that you run into is that it's extraordinarily hard to maintain the right people. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that these are bad people that you hire, but you don't have time to assess someone's strengths and weaknesses and put them in the place that they will go best. It's like, we need 30 engineers on that problem next Tuesday, go find them. We need 6 artists here, we need this here, and you're just doing it, you're just swallowing it. And so you very quickly, you have people who are not being onboarded. You come into this organization, you threw your CV over the door, You got hired, you show up, and you're kind of like, well, someone's going to tell me what I'm going to do here. This is going to be great. A core problem that every fast-growing project I've ever seen has, Blizzard had it, Xero had it, is people show up and they have no context. They have no idea what the company's doing. They have no sight of a goal. They have no real idea what they're supposed to be doing. They just kind of wander around and get told to do something randomly. And it's really important not to underestimate the effect this has. It looks like you've hired 10 people, 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, but you've actually hired a whole bunch of lost souls who are not on board with you. Fundamentally, they want to be, they are keen, but the overall effectiveness of your process, of your resource use, of your relationships, and of everyone's alignment towards a goal is not there. So you can see, I'm arguing sort of, these things reinforce each other. And they happen at all scales. If you are an awesome, tiny company with 4 people, and you hire the 5th person, you will still feel the ripples of this as you try and bring a new person into your clutch. If you are larger, the ripples will be bigger, and as pressures mount, you see the symptoms even more. And then, of course, if all these things aren't happening, if everything is back and forth and going, circularly, snake eating its tail, but effective leadership becomes extraordinarily hard. And because everyone sees and feels that everything's in chaos, they start to say, well, the people in charge have no idea what they're doing, which then undermines you as a leader, which then makes it harder to fix things again. So our ideal sort of world has come down to this. And what has actually happened, and again, I suspect this is the point where I hope you will all agree with me. Actually, what's happened is reality has gone out the window. And this is a really distinct point. It was absolutely the case on Blood Drive. It was also the case at times at the Abuse and Care Inquiry, where your kind of external connection to like what you're actually doing and why just vanishes. And it all just becomes a sort of series of stories that everyone is telling each other. And everyone knows that thing is true, that we're supposed to be doing. And everyone knows because they've been essentially locked in a room under crisis mode and talking to each other. The Chinese whispers multiply. The rumours overwhelm. And very often leadership at this point starts sort of outlining things that are absolutely impossible and everyone knows it. You know, the big speech in front of everyone. Okay, we know that things are a bit chaotic, but we are actually going to finish that project in 3 weeks. And we are going to add this much revenue, and we're going to sell this many things. And that's a reflection of leadership essentially flailing and trying to get a rope around things. But everybody starts to get the sense of, we are not in Kansas anymore. Reality has gone. Just to check, and I'm genuinely not trying to be negative or cynical, I'm just trying to kind of describe. Those of you who have been on interesting/unusual projects, does this resonate in terms of that idea of like reality kind of being out the window? You've been, yeah, okay, so we've been here, yes. And the reason that I'm trying to use these kind of more extreme examples, like an earthquake, an abusive inquiry, a very troubled game project, is we see the more normal things that happen around us in really sharp relief. One of the problems that we had at the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, was you had a genuine HR problem with people having heart problems, because a whole bunch of people had found the purpose they'd always been looking for. You know, everything you do is helping to save a city. So you had people working 22 hours a day, and week after week after week. And then all of these things went, and someone who's been working 22 hours a day for any period of time, they are not connected to reality. If we're all in this boiler room and we're all in crunch or any form of that, reality is probably at best adjacent to our operations. And it's an interesting and dangerous place to be. So, we are in the tangle. And this is the interesting space. And this is where we can break down, but we can also look to a bunch of examples and find our way through it. And again, this is where, and I hope you'll see why, I'm not going to argue for kind of you should use this particular variation of an agile process, or you should apply this crisis communications framework. I'm going to talk bigger and human about this. So, where are we? Yep, exactly. A familiar place, I think. We've been there, we feel it, and there is that just kind of sense of, you know, we are so fucked. And it ripples up and down through the project or the organisation. And when I have been in these places, the first probably 5 or 10 times, I have been around a lot of crises, I got psychologically and physically wrecked as well. When I was down in Canterbury, I went through a period where I basically didn't sleep, partly because at night in my small apartment, I was trying to sleep and I'd be looking up and there's this really big crack in the ceiling from one of the earthquakes. And in the middle of the night, I would wake up, almost like a little dog, and I'd be like, why am I awake? And then one of the evening earthquakes would rumble through like a freight train, because there were actually 10,000 earthquakes. There weren't 5. It was just a continual thing. And so when I was down there, I was a lot younger and hadn't run into these things as much. I mean, I wasn't eating right, I wasn't sleeping right, everything went. So I was very much in hell. My marriage at the time suffered, which is, so again, you're kind of sitting there staring at the crack in the ceiling, which is like the crack in reality and the crack in your life. And you're like, Jesus Christ. So this is where I'd like to introduce our special guest history star. Because one thing that I do like to do is go, okay, as bad as it can possibly feel in the strangest possible projects, what is the most extreme version of this? And yes, this is a little ship called the Endurance. This is the year 1915. This is the Trans-Antarctic Expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton was vexed that someone had reached the South Pole before him. So this expedition was going to be that he was going to walk across Antarctica with a team. They sailed in the ship Endurance. They did not get anywhere near actually landing on Antarctica. They got frozen in ice for months upon months upon months. And every night when they were trying to sleep in their bunks inside the ship, they could hear the ship cracking as the ice put its clutches into it. Every night. Shackleton's diary is terrifying. He's like, oh, it's, So pretty soon after this photo was taken, the ice claimed the Endurance. So a group of men, this is 1915, World War I is going on. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, these guys said goodbye in the UK about a year ago, set off, and we'll see you guys in a few years. Nobody knows where they are, because they've drifted so far away from the position. There's no radio communication. There's no way of reaching anything. So you're literally on the ice floes of Antarctica. Your ship has sunk. You have no supplies other than the few things you've managed to salvage from the ship that has sunk. And as far as everyone else is concerned, you will be coming back in a few years, if ever. This is a pretty good sort of, we are fucked type of moment, I think. It's an immensely powerful thing because Scott, sort of Scott of the Antarctic, who was a kind of rival explorer, was famed in some circles for when things got really tough, his leadership actually crumbled quite badly, and he tended to demoralize his men. And that's why Scott lost people on his expeditions. Shackleton's very different. Shackleton was immensely stubborn and cared a lot. So Shackleton sort of reasserted himself. And he was like, okay, even this is not that bad. We can still function in this space. This is, again, Shackleton's diaries are fascinating because he really goes through the thought process. He is a human being. He is terrified, he is stressed, he has not eaten properly. He's not some Superman who's like, everything will be fine. He is as worried as anyone, but he is determined. And Shackleton would not use this terminology, and some of you may have seen this, but you go right back down to a much more basic framework than the processes that we usually use. This is the OODA loop, which is very simply, you observe, okay, what can I see, what's around us on a essentially momentary basis. Okay, from the immediate situation in front of me, I'm going to orient myself. Where am I? What does this mean? What's going on? And then from there, okay, given just that information, what's the next thing I'm going to do? Nothing bigger, no giant plans, no 5-year thing. Okay, what am I going to do? Do it. And then go right back to the start of the loop, and as soon as you do the thing, you go, okay, now where am I now? What does this mean? What's the next thing I'm going to do? This is a framework that is used by everyone from fighter pilots in battle to people who get dropped into jungles to people trying to navigate crises. And it looks almost absurdly simple. Like you go, well, aren't frameworks supposed to be big and complex, and aren't consultants supposed to charge you a lot of money for them? Under the kind of pressures that we're talking about, most of those larger frameworks just collapse. And this is kind of my point. You can, over-engineered processes, they work well if they can be automated or if you can just kind of operate them normally. But when shit really hits the fan, you as a human being are going to get psychologically reduced down to a very small window of bandwidth. This is your friend. And again, Shackleton would not have used this terminology, but Shackleton very much operates on this. So Shackleton goes, okay, I'm cutting out small parts of the story, but this is basically what happened. I've got my men to a temporarily safe bit of land. We need to summon help. The nearest help is 800 miles away, across the worst stretch of ocean on the planet, in winter, and it's a whaling station called South Georgia, which is off the coast of South America. Our only option is for someone to get to that and to summon help. So this is actually them kicking off. Shackleton takes the remains of the only rowboat that they could salvage from the Endurance, so that is literally a rowboat. They did it up and they kind of put boards across it so you could kind of sleep underneath. And Shackleton and several of his men pushed off into the surf and began to sail 800 miles of the worst ocean ever in a rowboat with not enough food and essentially dead reckoning their way to an island that they did not know well enough that was 800 miles away. Thank you. But as soon as you establish a clear goal, even if it's a really hard goal, and you stick to it, and you go, men, we're not going to stand still, we're going to go somewhere, leadership returns. And if leadership returns and you have a clear goal, everything else starts to come together. You get into a mode, I am going to say this, let's fucking go. And it's a very distinct thing because you've come through the tangle. The tangle is all about uncertainty and ambiguity and self-doubt and all these type of things. But if you can get through it, there's a really distinct moment where you seize the sword and you enter into a new approach. If I were to suggest a very rough framework for how you operate in this space that is different from most of the things that we work with, reconnect with reality. That is the ultimate, literally, if you are the person who just goes on the project, hey, can we look at reality rather than all the things that we're imagining? This is really powerful. Set a clear goal. Re-communicate it. This is something that leaders struggle with because when you've been in the tangle, it's so tempting to kind of huddle away as leaders and not talk to everyone. Re-communicate. Everybody, I'm Ernest Shackleton. We're in a really bad spot, but I'm going to sail this boat with you guys across 800 miles and we're going to basically save everyone. This is the plan. There's no point in having the 2 or 3 man sort of Shackleton committee that doesn't tell anyone what's going on. Movement is life, stasis is death. If there's one heuristic, this is the most important. In general, when you're in the tangle on a project, the temptation is either to flail or to do nothing. Both are wrong. Purposeful movement. You want to adapt and improvise. And this is where, again, process, many of us, especially in the kind of production world, we love process. Process is our safety blanket, it's our cradle. You're going to have to let go of that to some extent. And you're going to be continually in that OODA loop of adapting and improvising. The reason I have written trust there 5 times, and I say it, trust, is this is the foundation of everything else. If you do these other things, you communicate, you have the clear goal, you rebuild trust with people, and under pressure, trust is the only thing that matters. I worked for someone in, basically down in Canterbury, who had been strongly involved in special forces stuff. And he would say, and he's right, the only thing that matters under extreme pressure is that you trust each other. And you have to give each other the ability to do that, which comes from all these other things. And again, acknowledge that we are human, even though we're in an increasingly automated world full of process. Your physiology, if you're not sleeping, you really, really, really need to do everything you can to fix that. The narrative that you tell yourself, broadly speaking, there are positive and negative narratives. You must, one way or another, find a way to instill a positive, optimistic, essentially story in yourself. Reality-based with a bias towards optimism, not reality-based with a bias towards everything's bad. Connect with others, and this is again what we've talked about. And if you do all these things, ultimately as a process, and this is almost literally a checklist that you can follow, victory emerges. This is the key. We have arrived in our little rowboat at South Georgia. We're going to rescue everyone. This is the conclusion of the talk. My childhood awaits me, but thank you very much for your time, everyone.
It's terrible.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for your time.